I was an ISIS recruiter on Twitter. I grew up in Iraq. I lived in a small village just south of Najaf. My family rarely visited Najaf because it was expensive to visit a big city. We were far from rich, but we made a decent living with our small farm. We grew some grain and had a few sheep. Life was not extravagant, but we had happy lives nonetheless. As you might imagine, my family was Islamic. We were good practicing Shia Muslims before the war happened. The war began in the year 2003 and it ruined my and my family's lives. We didn't know why the US military was attacking us, but I did later learn that it was because the US government believed our country possessed powerful weapons. I just want to make a point that it was very hard for us to keep up with current events due to our lack of technology. It was months into the war before we even knew there was one to begin with. I still remember how it happened, as if it was this morning. I woke up before everyone else in my family to tend to the sheep. The area we kept the sheep in was about 10 meters from the house. I just finished feeding the sheep when it happened. I heard them coming, but by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. I don't know how or why it happened, but a bomb was dropped on my family's house. The entire house was blown to smithereens. The only comfort I had was in knowing that my family died instantly and there was no suffering. But that day forever changed me. I needed revenge on the Westerners who did that to my family. Westerners often claimed that things like that were accidents, but what was I supposed to do? Shrug my shoulders and say, well, my family's dead and my life is ruined, but we're all good. I drifted along in life for quite some time. I didn't know where I was going or how I was going to get my revenge, but I was determined to survive. I spent a few years as a beggar and lived off the charity of strangers as I had no other way to support myself. Life was extremely difficult for me at that time. Things did get better for me though. I traveled further and further westward in Iraq. Eventually, I found a wealthy man in Mosul who took me in and cared for me as if I were his own son. His name was Saeed. He gave me food, water, and a place to regain my strength. I thanked him for his hospitality and offered to return the favor in any way I could. Well, I would soon come to discover that this man was a member of ISIS and was hoping I would join him. He told me I would be able to avenge my family's deaths and serve Allah while doing so. I really wasn't excited about joining. I heard stories about what they did to non-Muslims, especially Christians. I did not want to harm innocent people, but I wanted to destroy the United States for what they did to my family, so I agreed to join. After all that Saeed had done for me, it was the least I could do for him, and besides, it was the only choice I had outside of going back to begging in the streets. I spent many months with the other members of ISIS, and my dedication was questioned a few times in the beginning. I eventually proved myself by bombing a nearby Christian school for girls. I felt incredibly guilty about doing this, but the other members told me I'd done a good job. The more time I spent with the other men involved in ISIS, the less guilty I felt about the things I was doing, but the guilt of my actions never fully went away. I committed many more atrocities as the months passed, and I don't want to go into too much detail as I'm still in hiding, both from the US government as well as ISIS itself. But what I will say is that I'm not proud of what I did, and if I could go back and change my past, I would. Anyway, as I was gaining notoriety amongst the other members of ISIS, they began to see something in me that they found very useful. I was extremely persuasive. As I proved myself time and again, I was eventually promoted to be in charge of the recruitment efforts of ISIS after only serving for a few years. I was extremely happy about the promotion at the time, as it meant that I would not have to spend so much time attacking innocent people. I might add that by this time, the pain of losing my family was almost completely gone, and I felt like I'd killed enough Westerners that it was even. But there was no way in hell that I was going to be able to leave ISIS. It's easy to join, but there's only one way out. Death. And it's only a swift death if you're lucky. I was once ordered to torture a man to death who refused to follow orders. The higher-ups in ISIS didn't do that very often. However, it was mainly an intimidation tactic used to let us know that there would be consequences if we failed to serve the Islamic State. This was the time when I genuinely began to question ISIS. I had my doubts to begin with, but being forced to torture that man was what led me to question everything even further. That guy was just being praised the other day for being a devout servant of Allah, and just a few days later, he's being tortured to fucking death like a pig. That was the first time I started to see ISIS for what it was. But like I said earlier, there was no peaceful way out. I had to just stick it out and not question my orders. The only person I had to talk to about everything going on was Saeed. He also had questions and was very skeptical of the things that were going on. He told me about his past. When he was a Christian, he told me how he had no authority and felt extremely powerless and weak. Then, Saeed told me something I never knew about him. Apparently, when he was a Christian, he was forced to convert to Islam by ISIS, or he would have faced death. They also threatened to kill his wife in front of him. He agreed to convert, but unfortunately for him, his wife refused. She said she'd rather die standing than live on her knees. The last time Saeed saw his wife alive, she called him a coward for converting. I didn't see him as a coward though. He did what he had to do to survive. I could tell by the look in his eyes that he was a miserable man. He hid it very well in front of others, but this must have been what was underneath all this time. It felt weird connecting with him like this. I asked him why he wanted me to join if it made him so miserable. He replied that he needed someone like him in here with him. He called me one of the good ones, and I instantly knew what he meant. The door slammed open as another member made a dramatic entrance. We did our best to hide our newfound feeling of camaraderie and our talks of blasphemy, and asked what was going on. We were informed that we were moving our operation to a new location, one that was much bigger and much better. Apparently, ISIS was able to build a new command center with high-speed internet and availability to technology from the West. I became curious as to who was able to fund this entire thing. I asked another high-ranking member about it. He told me a Western banker man funded its creation. I asked him who he was, and I couldn't get a name out of him, but in the West, he's known as the man who broke the Bank of England. I didn't know much about Western men, but I was curious as to why he was helping ISIS out in this way. But my curiosity was quickly forgotten when I started learning how I would be proceeding with our recruitment efforts. I was instructed to utilize social media. Being that I was, after all, a peasant farmer who only had access to technology like this because of his service to ISIS, it took me a while to adjust to using social media and the internet. The senior members showed me the ropes and even let me in on some interesting information. I was informed that most social media websites heavily monitored their users and banned any accounts that partook in criminal activities such as recruiting people to ISIS. But we had an advantage that most other users didn't have. The man who funded the new base I mentioned earlier also had a lot of control of an entire website. The website was Twitter. He was able to pull strings behind the scenes to ensure that there would be no interference with our operations. We could do whatever we wanted, and no amount of complaints, blocks, or reports would have any impact on our account. We were invincible. As I grew more accustomed to using the internet, I seemed to be making a lot of progress. Convincing people to give up their safe lifestyles to come out and fight for the Islamic State was much harder than I ever imagined, but I was still able to attract a steady stream of eager recruits. The most effective tool was the PayPal account we had access to. Our funder put in thousands of dollars for us to use at our own discretion. Obviously, I was only able to use it as my leadership saw fit. For some reason, giving someone online a few $100s really did the trick. I gained their trust, helped them out, and within a few weeks, they agreed to come out to Iraq and fight for us. I guess people really do appreciate it when you help them out in their time of need. Still though, it was strange to think about. After all, these people were giving up their lives, not for their country or their religion or anything nearly as important, but for a stranger who gave them a few $100s. I know it was extremely manipulative on my part, but it made me feel so empowered. I was able to look past the atrocities committed by my people so long as I could elate myself and influence people this way. By this point, I became more aware of what ISIS actually was, which made the manipulation of these people feel all that much better. I was able to talk them into fighting for a facade, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. What felt even better was when I began learning to speak English. It was quite difficult and took a very long time, but when I was able to deceive Western people into leaving their own country and giving up their lifestyles to fight for Islam, I felt more powerful than I ever thought I could have. I'll never forget the first Westerner I convinced to join the Islamic State. He was an 18-year-old boy from New York. He'd recently been kicked out of his parents' house and had nowhere else in the world left to turn, except for me. I paid his bills for 2 months to gain his trust. I started talking him into reading the Quran, and after a few lengthy conversations, he was on board. I never failed to find the amusement in the fact that I was able to convince someone to turn their back on their own people and join an organization whose sole purpose was to wreak havoc on the Western world. I thought to myself how easy it would be if there was just a few hundred men like me doing this. We could bring the entire Western population over to our side by this method alone, and none of them would be the wiser. There was one incident that I eventually found to be quite sobering to the situation. After a few years of sticking to Twitter as a means of recruitment, I became numb to my impact on the world. I hadn't even realized that I literally recruited hundreds of helpless people to ISIS, and one day I saw a clip. It was someone I'd recruited, a 16-year-old man from the UK. The clip showed him spraying an AK-47 into a crowd of people. In the crowd was a small child whose body was littered with bullets. I felt a lot of guilt knowing the part I played in the events leading to that, but like I was able to do in the past, I ignored it and got on with my life. The idea of someone losing their child like that stayed with me for a few days, but I was pretty numb to death by this point. I still can't say why that one incident stayed with me for as long as it did. But one day, things came to a boiling point. As I mentioned earlier, the way Saeed ended up here was fucked up to say the least. From the time I first met him, I knew that he was going to avenge the death of his wife, even if her last breath was used to insult him. After other members of ISIS paid extra attention to Saeed's lines of communication, they discovered that he was secretly undermining the operations. It wasn't anything major, but he would empty some gunpowder before it would be used in explosives, waste ammunition, and create other minor inconveniences. This was enough justification they needed to take him out into the desert, torture him, and leave him there to die in agony. When I heard of what happened to Saeed, I was sitting at the table I always worked at. I couldn't believe it. I knew ISIS was strict, but he put in years of service and helped in ways no other man could have. I knew I had to do something. He was a good man and did not deserve such a terrible fate. I wouldn't allow Saeed's murder to go unavenged. Originally, I planned on going out with a bang, guns blazing and everything, but I realized that I'd amassed enough wealth that I could have any future I wanted. I wasn't an old man and didn't want to waste the rest of my life to avenge Saeed's. I know that sounds selfish, but what would you have done? I'd imagine you wouldn't have even done what I did. I planned to escape, but not before creating chaos before I did. Before my escape, I made sure to tweet out horrific things about ISIS that would surely draw attention to the account we used. I also donated all the money in the PayPal account to some stranger online. It was roughly $374,000 US. I'm not 100% sure who it was donated to, but whoever it was had a lucky day. I knew that people would catch on and realize what I'd done rather quickly, so I made my way out that night as fast as I could. After leaving the base, I was able to see the vehicle I planned on stealing before a man stopped me to ask a few questions. We were out, alone in the darkness. He looked me directly in the eyes and began to speak.
Hey,
I put the gun back into my pocket and sprinted the rest of the way to the car. I drove as fast as I could until the thing ran out of gas. I eventually traveled many miles by foot, and suffice to know, I made my way to a nice small area that somewhat resembles my old home before the war. I don't have any technology, weapons, or anything of the sort. I have spent quite a bit of time contemplating my actions during those few years of my life, and I still regret most of what I did. All those Westerners I deceived, the people I killed, the lives I forever ruined. There was quite a bit on my shoulders. This may come as a surprise, but I still remained loyal to the Islamic faith. ISIS has done nothing but destroy and take. They may have taken my innocence, but I wasn't going to let them take away my faith as well.